Back to the power and conflict poems. And this time I want to be looking at the idea of the power of nature. It's something that hasn't actually come up yet. It came up in one of the sample assessment papers. So it's obviously something they're thinking might be happening with Storm on the Island there, but it's yet to come up in a proper full answer. So I thought about this, and as usual, what I'm trying to do, because I'm trying to drive you towards level 6 responses, so I'm trying to get you to think in more perceptive ways about this. And I thought that really this quote that comes from the prologue, the prelude, as you reckon, led by her, is almost at the heart of what I would think about here. This personification of nature, the idea of nature being something that draws us in, that drags us in, that takes us somewhere. He may have got it wrong there in the way it's done, but it's certainly worth us considering. So I'm going to look at it in two groups, because obviously one of the main areas is the Romantics, where their concern with nature is huge. I'm going to look at the poems of the Romantics, and I'm going to look at some poems from the 20th century in comparison, how they use the idea of nature. But my real thesis going on underneath this is that even though we associate it more with the Romantics, all poets, or the majority of poets, and certainly ones that we see here, see nature as this overwhelming, overarching force that has to be respected and revered. Okay, actively, not just we need to notice how strong it is, we actually almost have to revere it, worship it almost, for it to understand its significance. Now, the Romantics, and remember, they weren't known as that to begin with. In fact, it probably would have been an insult to them at the time, because it suggested something quite light and frivolous. But the Romantics, one of the things that was behind their poetry was a love and enthusiasm for nature, and the idea that nature was almost their god. There wasn't a great deal of religion behind a lot of what they wrote about. There was belief in some of them, but nature was almost like a god to them in sorts of ways. And so much of it was focused on this concept of what we might call the sublime, okay, or what they call the sublime. We use that word now, of course, to reflect something that is particularly wonderful, beautiful, incredible, yeah, and apply it as an adjective. But the sublime to them is that feeling that you get when you are confronted by the enormity, power, and overwhelming aspect of nature. Okay, that moment, and I don't think you may not have had it at any point, but some of you may have done, where you can sit there and you can think, oh my God. It could be that the universe is huge, oh my God, how small am I compared to that? It could just be, look at what this planet is, and I am just, compared to that, I am nothing. Humans are nothing. I personally would say I got that when I visited the Grand Canyon, standing over the Grand Canyon for the first time, looking out into it. Took the breath away, literally. And I mean literally. I'm asthmatic, and it started an asthma thing. But anyway, but it actually also, in terms of sublime, it got me thinking to myself, this, I suppose to somebody religious, it would be, here's God, this is God. But in a sense, to me, it is that idea that nature is just huge and massive and overwhelming and so much more important. And that's what we see at the heart of a lot of the Romantic writing about it. Now, there's another aspect of it as well, you see, their fears for humanity and nature, because, and I mean, Blake particularly, even though we're not looking at London here in terms of nature, this is a theme behind London. Blake was a particular example of this, someone who, looked on England like this. Okay, a very famous painting, the Hay by Constable, but it's this what we call pastoral image of England. This beautiful green land with lovely calm streams going past, beautiful trees and everything there. That's what they meant. They meant, look, nature, this is what life should be. People out there working in common with nature, in harmony with nature. But their feeling was that it had turned into this. The Industrial Revolution had taken away that connection with nature that we had. Okay. And that meant that we were falling away from who we are. Now, you see that in London as a question, but we really want to apply that to this concept of the need for people to respect and understand nature. This is not respect and understand nature. It's replacing nature and thinking we can take control and power. Of course, it's quite prescient, really, prescient, I mean, because, of course, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing there from the Industrial Revolution kick-started and started the process that we now see as climate change. Now, I'm going to start with Wordsworth, and not from this poem, not from the prelude that we have, but from another poem of his, famous poem, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. We get this very well-known quote, which I think kind of sums up the attitude I'm going to suggest that we see in the prelude and in Ozymandias particularly, and in a lot of the letters, that nature never did betray the heart that loved her. So note that focus. If within yourself, within your heart, within your sense of who you are, you love and revere nature, then nature will not betray you. But of course, by extension, if you don't, then it may well do. And this is what happens with the prelude. Okay? The prelude is about somebody who thinks they love nature, but he's a schoolboy. He's a child. And his love of nature is that nature is something that serves him. It makes him happy. It makes him, it's something that he can use to his advantage. And he has to learn that he is not in control of nature, nature is in control of him. And he has to learn that loving nature in your heart is actually loving something dangerous. So just to take a few examples from the prelude, I'm not going to go into detailed analysis. You can find that elsewhere, and there's videos that I've recorded up on the website that will look at these in detail if that's what you're interested in. I just want to pick out a few little things here in particular. First of all, the fact that, taking the phrase that I've used at the beginning here, initially he seems to think that nature is leading him. He seems to think that he is working in harmony with nature, that nature wants him to steal this boat and take it out onto the lake. I can't see really any other interpretation for led by her myself. You can take it that way, but that's how I'm seeing it. And then further down, as he unloosed her chain. Now, obviously, that's reality. You know, it's chained up and it's got a chain looped over that's holding it from floating out into the lake. But when you think about that phrase, unloosed her chain, it's as though he is freeing the boat from slavery, freeing it from its bondage. At this point, that's how he sees it. Look at this boat, it's being chained up. I'm freeing it. I'm giving it freedom. Now, one of the things about this is, even though it's a memory, it is presented very clearly at the beginning in the way that he felt about it at the time. You could suggest there's elements of foreshadowing in things such as the phrase, it was an act of stealth or troubled pleasure. That oxymoron, troubled pleasure, could be seen as a kind of foreshadowing of what's to come, right? But I think more likely it reflects the way that he feels. That very boys are at that age. You get pleasure from things that are a little bit, you know, stretching the bounds of what you should do. You know, you want to be a little bit naughty, a little bit like trouble pleasure. And I think that really sums up his feeling at this point. So we're not getting a poem that's going, and I knew, and I didn't know this was going to happen. It sets us up with no real idea of what is coming. And I think that's very, very important. He focuses then very, very clearly for me on his view of nature at this point. The beautiful image, it's a beautiful piece of writing, this. Small circles glittering idly in the moon until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. It's an absolutely gorgeous image Okay, and there's so much you can see within that of how he views nature, but also maybe even the restricted nature. What about these small circles? Is it just an image of beauty? Is that reflecting that enclosed nature of his view? Circle, the little world that he lives in, that he sees and understands. When he then later on talks about his skill, he wants to show off even to himself. He's the only person there. His skill in rowing by setting himself up a little challenge to go in an unswerving line, fixing his eye on this point. But when you think about what he's actually saying, he's talking about the idea, again, his view of nature, it's unswerving. In fact, this is followed up, of course, by the idea about focusing on the horizon's utmost boundary, which is a very interesting idea in as much as it seems to me always to suggest what his horizon is at this point, because of course in a minute something beyond that horizon is going to creep up and change everything. Yeah, his limited horizons as he's looking at it at the moment. And then here, where he goes through the passion of his enthusiasm at rowing through the lake, using this image of going through the water like a swan, the beauty, the grace he feels he's performing with. So it's all as beautiful, almost perfect, almost idyllic imagery of him by these lakes. Remember, this is the Lake District. That's where he lived. He's out there, and that's this. He's on his way home from school at the time of an evening, and you know it's summer evening. It's perfect. It's wonderful. But maybe it's only at this point that we start to get a little sense, if we're reading closely, that there might be something else going on under the surface. Because what then happens, of course, is we get that volta, and this is the biggest volta that, you know, we'd see in any of it. I mean, this is a massive turning point. And he deliberately cuts it into the middle of a line when it happens, almost switching a bit like in My Last Duchess, when, you know, the revelation that he's murdered his Duke is just slipped in the middle. He's murdered his Duchess, the Duke. And this is again, but it's massive. Everything turns on its head for him at that moment. Everything's been perfect, and then suddenly up comes this peak. And his language goes huge, black and huge. He can't even express himself anymore. And it leads towards the most important part of the prelude for me, which is the conclusion, the ending, the bit in which the effect of it comes towards him. We get this very abstract image here of the effect afterwards, his brain working with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. Now, not only have we got this sense that he is seeing modes of existence that he's never understood before, right? Not just my views are a bit different to what I thought. It's like a whole way of existence, a whole idea of humanity that's never been, he's never got before. But also at the same time, it's dim and undetermined. He doesn't really understand it yet. It's only vaguely there on the horizon. This is a moment that hasn't just flipped and turned him into something very different. It hasn't just turned him into something very, very different. What it's done is it's sparked off a complete change in his personality. Now, I'm not a fan of context being pulled in. They say very clearly, don't use bolted on context and think it's, you know, it's not a history exam, it's a literature exam. But I don't know if you're aware that Wordsworth's father, mother and father died before he was 13. So before any of this had happened. And in fact, the way his dad died at the age of 13, I mean, this is tragic, horrific. His dad, like himself, loved nature and went out walking in the Lake District and used to go on these long, long expeditions out there. And one day he went and he was a bit lost, and he was fog and mist and all kinds of things around there, and ended up having to spend the night out in the lakes, out in the moors around it. He came home the following day and he was sick. He was ill and he died. Literally, he was killed by nature. No wonder this had such an effect upon him, to feel that kind of issue there. So I think these lines are very, very important in coming in. He then brings it on further in the end bit here when he describes how, you know, we don't have the old form of nature. But again, this idea of huge forms, going back to that huge idea. And the real issue is the effect it has on his mind. The mind. During the day, the dreams by night. This is kind of a pre-psychology era, but we get still that sense they still understood the idea that dreams are a strange thing. So what I'm suggesting here with the prelude is that what we've got is the story of somebody who needed to learn what it is to love and respect and revere nature, who thought they did, but then had to learn it. It seems a tiny event, and people almost laugh at this when they first come across it. You know, boy rows out onto lake, boy sees mountain, boy gets scared. But we can see the effect it has is to leave him in a kind of no man's land, a lack of understanding. Something's different, and he hasn't completely got what it is yet. Now, Ozymandias takes a similar idea, but more from almost like the idea of a cautionary tale, doesn't it? It's the idea that we get of a man who kept going all through his life and didn't find this respect and revering for nature, and therefore has suffered the consequences of it in the long term. Now, he starts very clearly by distancing us from this to make sure that this is a tale. It's almost like a fairy tale for us. It's like a morality tale. I met a traveller from an antique land who told me this story. There's no other reason for it to be there, no other need for it to be there. I met a traveller, he told me this, right? And then, of course, we get into these details that suggest that, you know, the vastness of the statue, that suggests that what he was trying to do was build up, a bit like skyscrapers these days, the idea of building up. Why? Because it's almost like confronting nature. Like, forget gravity. Not that he would have known of gravity. Well, Shelley would have done, but forget gravity, forget the laws of nature, forget the difficulties. I can go as high up as I want. Yeah, it's almost that confrontation that's there, and it's that then leads to the flattening of it at the end. Quite the opposite. You try and build up high. What have we got? We've got flatness everywhere. This is what nature will do to you, given it time. And I think what I would focus on, you're all aware it's a sonnet. I would focus on the sestet, the final 6 lines. Remember, the basic idea of a sonnet normally, oh, for God's sake, don't try and bring up all this stuff. Oh, it's a love poem because he loves himself. Bit of rubbish. What's more interesting, if anything's there about poetry, about a sonnet, is the normal structure that you usually get 8 lines and then you get 6 lines, an octet and a sestet. And at the beginning of the sestet, you get a volta, and we get it here, a turnaround, a change. And the octet usually sets out an issue, and the sestet kind of resolves it or takes it in a different direction. It's almost like, here's all this, but then again, this. It's that kind of idea of an argument. If we look at the sestet, it's balanced in 2 triplets. The first one presents the bombast of Ozymandias, the legacy he expected to leave. Okay, that he wasn't even talking to his own he wasn't even talking to his own people that he was ruling over. He's talking to other kings. He's talking to other important people. He's talking to the mighty and telling them that he's better than them. Why? Look on what I've achieved, my works. I mean, I suppose our thought is, you know, we know about this statue. What else was there? What does he mean when he says, look on my works? You know, what else was there originally? But whatever it was, it's all gone. So there's his bombast, first of all, presented to us in all of its style, in all of its grandness. And by the way, kings, please don't try and suggest it's a reference to Jesus, right? This is like 2,000 years before Jesus, isn't it? Why it's Ozymandias like, I don't know, looking in the future and saying, I'm comparing myself to somebody who hasn't lived and will live 2,000 years later. It's just King of Kings. But then what we get is to get the immediate contrast next to it. Nothing beside remain. So 3 words undercut those 3 lines. The bombast. Here I am. Here's what I've achieved. There's nothing there. That's what nature's done to him. For his arrogance and his belief that he is better than nature. It's so romantic, that idea, to show how nature has brought somebody down to size in the same way that that boy was brought down to size in the prelude. It comes back to these paired images, boundless and bare, lone and level, sand stretch. The boundless and bare, again, that image of nature, like with the peak, as something that just is aggressive, dangerous, is not beautiful, it stands out there. But the lone and level sands stretching out, the sense of, as we said, flatness. I often say this is a poem about the second law of thermodynamics, isn't it? You know, that everything will tend towards chaos eventually. There's nothing you can do to stop it. And that's very much its point. So 2 poems from the Romantic period that show you that very romantic edge. And then we jump forward 200 or more years to the 20th century. And we deal with a couple of others here. Now, certainly this is a very strong possibility for what would come up if you were given a question on nature. But Storm on the Island, and once again, I'm just going to take a very quick thing here to warn you off any strange interpretations of this based around it being a political poem about Ireland and the troubles in Ireland. First of all, it was written in 1906. The troubles in Ireland began in 1967. I know there were issues beforehand, but it's certainly not something as big as this would suggest if you got it in there. So that turns it down first of all. Also, you don't have to spend long reading about Seamus Heaney to see he did not write political poems. Definitely, he was not a political polemicist. He did write a few, but not many. And also, if you're going for that Irish interpretation, I'll always say to anybody who goes there, well, what the hell's the trees bit about then? Fit that into your interpretation. Anyway, enough of that. Let's go to what it really does deal with. We start here. And what have we got? This is a poem, of course, about nature and humanity living together. It's about humanity choosing to live in a bizarre situation where nature is going to destroy it. Okay? Where nature is going to cause him problems. Horrific situation, but somehow humanity manages to survive. Now, how does humanity survive? By working in cooperation with nature, by respecting nature enough to actually use nature to or work alongside it. The sense here is as well as sinking walls into rock and building houses squat, showing respect for the reality of what's going to come to them. The focus here is we. Remember, it's not we all the way through. There's I's within here. There's first person's singulars in here, but we. Why? Because what's the real power that protects them against nature? Community. Working together as a community, respecting nature as a community. And that's how they coexist. Now, that's where the trees bit comes in, you see. It's a very, very strange section here. It's, as you can see, more than a quarter of the entire poem about something that isn't there. So it must be significant in its ways. Now, why? There aren't trees here. Why? Because it will be a comfort to us, because they would make a noise, etc., etc. Now, the thing I'm interested in really is this idea of them being, oops, I've got a word missing, a tragic chorus, of course, as it is in a gale. A tragic chorus. Now, that's obviously a reference to Greek tragedy, to the idea that in Greek tragedy, you know, like there you've got the semicircle coming around like you of an audience up there watching. You've got the stage up the front with the actors on here, very distant, very between. But in the middle, as many of you know, you had the chorus, a group of people who danced and sang and commented on what was going on stage and could communicate with the audience. So they served as kind of a bridge between the audience and the actors. And what they seem to be suggesting is that in normality, nature provides you with that middle ground. Nature provides you with that chorus. Nature will communicate with you. Nature will find a way to make things better for you if it allows it to. The trouble is, they've gone to the extreme of a place where there are no trees. And that's why this is such a dangerous place for them. It's a place they're not meant to be. So instead, when you get this, the brilliant extended metaphor of the wind as an air attack coming at you, diving and strafing at you, firing a salvo after the other, bombarding you. When you get to that point, all they can do is sit tight. All they can do is sit tight. And in the end, that's the solution. The solution is prepare. Show respect in your preparation. And just sit tight. There's nothing you can do. And you see, that's not a million miles away from those first two poems we looked at. But in this case, rather than the effect it's having on somebody's mind, this is people who are ready. They've gone through that experience and they are now just taking practical advice for this. They just sit tight and wait for it to finish. Now, the other two in the 20th century are very much focused on war, the ones that I would focus in on nature. And the idea, of course, will come up there that nature or our opposites, war is an unnatural thing. So if we take exposure to start off with, we get, as we know, a list of images, of beautiful images. God, he's a wonderful writer, Wilfred Owen, that cast the weather, the wind, nature itself, as the real enemy potentially to them. Creeping up on them and knifing them, tugging on the wire in the middle of no man's land, the barbed wire between them, massing up an army in the east, ready to attack them. And probably the most scary one here, the snow silently, palely coming around to feel for their faces. And one of the things Owen does is he uses sound so much in his poems. I mean, every little detail, if you ever look at his drafts, you see how much he focuses on small details. Every little detail is important, but the use of sound is particularly significant here. The fact that, for example, the harsh sibilance of the merciless ice winds that knife us, creating a sense of a really dangerous enemy in the first line of the poem. But then by the time we get to the snow, he's using this soft F alliteration to remind us that it appears gentle. Snow, it's virtually soundless as it comes down. Yet it's incredibly destructive. And particularly if you're stuck out and exposed to it. Now, this idea comes back most of all in this comparison here, where he brings in the actual enemy, using again sound to take their attacks, sudden successive flights of bullets, streaked silence, but comparing it to the idea that the air, shuddering with snow, is even more deadly than the bullets that are flying there. Excitement that points out just the danger of the weather. Now, what's the point behind this? Well, clearly, the idea, even though the importance of exposure really comes in the second half of the poem, for the soldiers themselves, what we're seeing here goes with the title for me, exposure. They are being exposed to the weather by, you know, the incompetence of the people running the war, people who are leaving them in trenches, people who are leaving them sat there in all weathers, in winter, in horrible things there, allowing them to be killed off by the weather rather than the enemy. It's another example of not showing that reverence for nature, that understanding of nature. But our place within it is not something that we can judge by starting a war. And just deciding, well, we're going to do this. We're just going to sit here. They didn't just sit tight like the people in exposure, because the people in exposure were, sorry, in Stormy Island, the people in Stormy Island were ready to sit tight. Here they're sitting tight and completely exposed. Now, a similar idea in terms of war comes in bayonet charge and its use of nature. Now, it might seem strange to think of bayonet charge because there's not much of it that's to do with nature, but I think there is enough that you would be able to use it as a second poem if you went to it. There's two key moments in it. The first one is at the beginning, in which it's structured that what he's running towards and shooting at him appears to be a green hedge. It gives the impression, remember that in the whole of bayonet charge, the enemy is never once mentioned. They're in the background, it's both, but they're never once mentioned in bayonet charge. There are no other humans mentioned in apart from the kid in bayonet charge. Even though we're talking about a situation in which he's running with an army towards another army, there is no one else there mentioned except him. And therefore, what it appears to be is that it's almost like he is attacking nature. And beautiful, nice, that green hedge. The unnaturalness is always fighting back against it. As he stumbles across nature, it's firing back at him. It's an even more explicit sense of what war is doing to nature and how unnatural it is and the lack of reverence that's there. And when then we get to the hair, and it's a masterstroke from Hughes, really, because he could quite easily have made this another soldier that he sees rolling about on the floor in agony and, you know, on fire and all that. But instead he chooses to make it a hare. And it seems a ridiculous idea to come in with. But it is, because what it shows us is the innocence of nature and the effect it has on this. We have a hare. I mean, hardly a, you know, a difficult creature, an unpleasant creature of any kind, a hare. Yeah. That's apparently turned yellow. It doesn't say it's on fire, but it's yellow and it rolls like a flame. So it's clearly given its issue. It's on fire in front of it. Perhaps something has happened. I don't know how you feel about animals, but I mean, it's absolutely horrific, that idea of it. And then to give us this sense of it crawling around in a circle, like it's threshing, a movement with no sense, again, the circle idea, go round and round and round, nowhere to go beyond there, with that awful image of its mouth wide open, silence. The silent scream. It's like, it does remind me of that, the wonderful painting, The Scream, the Monk one, the side, you know, holding on like that to his cheeks and screaming like that. It's an incredibly powerful painting, again, because it just appears that the silence of the scream is worse than hearing it, a feeling that the sound is there somewhere, and just to be able to look at it while its eyes stand out at you. There's so much you can pull apart in here to show the unnatural nature of war, to show the horror of what they're doing. And of course, where does it lead? It leads to millions dead. It doesn't have to tell us, it doesn't have to show us the outcome there in front of us. We know where it leads because we know what this war goes to. So, to bring it together and conclude, because with power and conflict, you get these broad questions, and there's always a tendency for people to kind of list images that they remember and quotations that they remember or have seen or can talk about, imagery, that kind of an idea. and think that's going to get them somewhere if they talk about it with all the things they know. I can tell you, as a marker myself, that does nothing. What we're looking for is an answer, is an interesting answer to the question. You're taking that idea and going forward. What is the power of nature across this anthology? Or what do we seem to see here? Well, the first thing that's clear is that nature is a living, breathing thing. That's something that all 5 of those poets are dealing with. Yeah? It's not just something to be looked at and drawn on a nice painting. It's living, it's breathing, and it is far more powerful than us. Far more powerful. Almost unimaginably more powerful. And particularly for the Romantics, living in a time in which they felt that ideal, that humans were trying to overpower nature and to replace it in the Industrial Revolution. That was a particularly important idea. So then, as a consequence, those who do not respect and revere it, and I think that revering is very, very important, show reverence for it, will run the risk of being destroyed, like the soldiers, like possibly the boy if he hadn't been careful. Destroying in his mind, that would be like what it does to Ozymandias over time. So the conclusion is, and Storm in the Island goes with this, we can work in harmony with it as long as we are led by her. That phrase at the beginning of the prelude, not the way he thought he was being led by her, but the reality of being led by nature, of understanding that it's there, not for us, but it's there, and we can only coexist with it and show our respect and reverence. And I think that's what they're trying to say and get across to us. Okay. Thank you very much.